My name is Emmanuel Kattan. I work for the British Council. I run a project called Our Shared Future. And I'm very pleased to welcome all of you here today. We're very pleased to be partnering as well with the Institute for Social Understanding, Policy and Understanding, with the Interfaith Alliance, and with the Religious Freedom Education Project at the Newseum. So welcome, everyone. Before we start, just a piece of information. The question came up during the last panel regarding the number of MPs in the British Parliament. It's actually 8 Muslim MPs, 3 of which are women, I'm told. So without further ado, I'd like to start our panel today, which deals with American Muslim, caricature versus reality. And we've been talking during the first panel about a number of issues relating to legal rights, to Sharia law. We know, of course, what the caricature is all about regarding Muslims in America. Prevailing prejudice regarding the fact that Muslims are foreigners, they're the enemy, the fact that they're anti-democratic or hold anti-democratic beliefs. What we're going to try and explore during the next hour and a quarter is the roots of the prejudice and the stereotypes, looking at ways in which these stereotypes play out politically and socially. And I'd like also to discuss how they can be tackled and what kind of ways can we find in terms of initiatives drawn from civil society, from the media, working in interfaith relations that can help actually tackle these stereotypes and move from caricature to reality. And I'd like, first of all, to start with introducing to you briefly our panelists. Imam Magid, sitting on my right, who is the president of ISNA. Sitting next to Imam Magid is Maria Ebrahimji, who is an executive producer at CNN. Mohamed Younis, senior policy advisor at Gallup. And sitting right next to me on my right is Rasheeda Muhammad, who is an author, a writer, a poet, and a historian. And I'd like to turn to you first, Mohamed, just to, if you could give us a little bit of an update on where we are in terms of perceptions of American Muslims today. I mean, we're entering a new election cycle now. 4 years ago, President Obama was elected, and shortly after his election made this famous speech in Cairo announcing a new beginning of relations with the Muslim world. This had some degree of impact on the Muslim community here in the U.S. And I'd like to know, where are we now, almost 4 years on? How have the trends evolved in terms of opinion about American Muslims?
Absolutely. Well, the picture is really mixed. I think the earlier panel gave us a very clear example of where, on the legal front, there have been several victories, but the continued still challenge. On the perceptions front, I think on the mass level, there have been a little fewer victories. A couple of studies that we've done in the past 3 or 4 years have really shown a continued challenge for Muslim Americans in terms of the perception of the average American towards them and towards their faith particularly. When you ask about self-reported prejudice, Muslims are still the #1 major religious group that receives the highest level of American respondents saying that they indeed feel a certain level of prejudice towards Muslims. When you ask about experiences of discrimination, Muslim Americans are on par with African Americans and Hispanic Americans, Latino Americans. I'm from the West Coast. We use that term. In saying that they've experienced an act of discrimination in the past year based on their religion, ethnicity, or racial appearance. So from the perceptions perspective, I think the challenges have still continued. You mentioned President Obama's speech in Cairo. I think from the rhetorical perspective, we've certainly seen a lot of progress. We've certainly seen a very concerted effort on the part of major figures in U.S. Policy circles and leadership, really trying to get us to the next level beyond the immediate sort of post 9/11, why do they hate us, and what descended into, I think, a very sort of a superficial conversation about Muslims and are they bad or are they good. We've moved into a place now where people are beginning to realize that actually Muslims are like everybody else in this country. They're individuals. And all of them are part good and part bad, like we all are as people. So the progress has certainly occurred. But I think the important work of organizations such as the many that brought us here today is still very much needed.
Right, right. Thank you. Turning perhaps to the role of the media, because when we're talking about caricatures, of course, we're talking about perceptions. We're talking about how people make up their minds about different groups of people. And of course, the media has a pretty big role to play in that. And turning to you, Maria, I'm curious to know, of course, we tend to accuse the media of many ills, and we tend to heap up a lot of blame on the media for creating stereotypes and sometimes also perpetuating them. So I'd be very curious to know from your point of view, how would you judge and estimate the role of the media? I mean, are we actually right to blame the media to the extent that we do, or is the media, simply reflecting part of public opinion as well?
I think it's both. I think we, and I include myself in this as an American Muslim, have every right to put some blame on the media for inaccurately portraying the Muslim community in some ways, or perhaps not being as inclusive in terms of diversity of thought that is in the Muslim community. I can't tell you how many times it frustrates me often to see only photos of women in hijab, for example, representing the American Muslim community, or only photos of men who have beards, or what people perceive to be the typical caricature of what a Muslim should be instead of what Muslims are. So we in the media, I've always felt as a journalist, I have a responsibility to accurately portray what the reality of the situation is. When I was working on the documentary with Soledad O'Brien about the Tennessee Masjid controversy, there was a lot of American Muslims who came to me and said, how could you put this documentary on the air? All you're doing is further perpetrating this idea that Muslims aren't welcome. And, we haggled a lot about whether the title should be Not Welcome, the Muslims Next Door. As a journalist, I felt very strongly that it should be, because all we did was take the sign that was posted right in front of that mosque land and reflect that. We went and did our own investigation and found that indeed this community was not welcome. And I think that in itself reflects good journalism. And it also sort of puts the issues out there for a larger community, our CNN audiences, to see and understand that there are people who have a misunderstanding of what Islam, my faith, is really all about. And so I stand very proudly behind that documentary. But yeah, I think it's split. I think media has a responsibility, but I think the community itself also has a responsibility to present itself in ways other than just as people who are defending their faith. We are all people who are committed to our country, to our professions, and to that extent, I think the caricature is changing because we're actually out there revealing identities beyond that of what we represent in our faith.
Right. You mentioned the community, and Imam Magid, of course, as president of the Islamic Society for North America, you've got your ear quite close to the ground, and I was wondering, in terms of the community itself, to what extent do you feel that it has been affected by this caricature? And I'm thinking about the Muslim community in America generally, but particularly also about the youth. And you've done so much work also with young people. How is that affecting their self-perceptions?
Thank you for inviting me. You have to know that a person is a product of their environment. They get impacted by what is around them, psychologically, emotionally. It shapes their thinking about themselves in terms of identity-wise. And it's very interesting that when close friends do a lot of interfaith, I do a lot of interfaith work with, they get so surprised that we have Girl Scouts in the Adams Center. And they say, oh, you have Girl Scouts. I said, would you have asked the same question about the church? They get surprised because it is not just something you can think about that Muslims do, or Boy Scouts program. That shows to me that the perceptions of our youth in media, that they're isolated. They are not really integrated. And they get bullied in school. Also, every time there's something negative about Islam and Muslims in media. And that's why when I hear the rhetoric about Islam and Muslims, and I told that to Herman Cain when he visited Adams Center, I said, everything you say about Sharia, about Islam, is about my children and the children of many people in this community who cannot just go to school like any other children. You put them at risk for being bullied, from being isolated, not have a sense of belonging to America. But I would like to say that although this is the case, but American Muslims have been doing a lot of work in establishing this program of outreach. Their children are working with youth from Jewish community and Christian community in various projects. If you come to Adams Center, for example, in one of those programs of Interfaith, you'll see most of the people around are young people that, they want to help, they want to reach out, they go and do soup kitchen, they feed the homeless. But they do this not thinking that they have to do it for political reason. They do this because they believe in it. But not to pick on media, it doesn't make news. It is not in the news that the Muslim students are sharing meals downtown in Project Downtown in MSA. For those are the issues that we're struggling with in terms of how the media and the public perceive Islam and Muslims. Let me tell you a joke, and I want to end here. They said two people argued about something moving on the horizon. One of them said, this is a goat. The other person says it's a bird. As they come closer to it, it flew away. The guy says it's a goat even if it flies. We as a Muslim American, no matter what we do, somebody said you're doing it for the wrong reason. You have taqiyya, you have bad intention. You are over to take America. You said, look to our interfaith work. Look the clinic the Muslim have. Oh, no. You have an agenda, hidden agenda. How can you prove yourself to people like that? Therefore, we are the machine that really have this hatred and bigotry against Muslims is a machine that you cannot win any argument with them. Therefore, what we would like to see happening, really, regarding our community, is to have more people visit the community from media. And we adopted a slogan, Mosque Without Wall. And we inviting people in this Ramadan across America to open their mosque for the public.
Right. This is fascinating, and I'm turning now to you, Precious Mohammed. One of the prevailing myths as well about Muslims in America is that they're newcomers, that they're foreigners. But the research that you've done and the work that you've done shows that Muslims have been in the U.S. for a very long time indeed. How does the factual evidence that you've unearthed about Muslim community's contribution to the history of America help counter some of the misperceptions that we were just talking about?
Okay. Well, first, I want to thank you all for having me. It's truly an honor to be here. And just want to greet everyone with the universal greetings of peace and al-Islam. Assalamu alaikum. I did take some time to jot down some notes because this is a unique opportunity and with a unique audience, and so I didn't want to leave out any important points. I think the most important thing to take away from this question today is that it is really a fact that Muslims contributed not only directly, that Muslims contributed directly and indirectly to the making of America, and that's really important. And you can find evidence of this in many historical newspapers, slave plantation records, presidential libraries and diaries, transcripts of speeches from the early 1800s of the House and the Senate, where you had actual senators and congressmen using the examples of Muslims in terms of treatment of slaves and using them as an example of why we should end slavery in America. So you see that as influencing the political conversation in America. You can see in the 1730s where a slave owner established a place of prayer for his slave in colonial Maryland. Because the slave had ran away because he wanted to be free, but he also ran away because he was being ridiculed while he was trying to pray. So when he was brought back, the owner actually established a place for prayer for him, and that was in the 1730s, and so that marks like the earliest documented time of a Muslim place of prayer in the United States, and then actually makes the slave a permanent part of that discussion, of that narrative about religious tolerance in America. You can look at Benjamin Franklin, one of the foremost founding fathers, and how he, in the 1739 Philadelphia, actually helped with the establishment of it's an interfaith prayer house, and that prayer house, in his book, he describes it as a place where even the head of the Muslim world, the head religious leader of the Muslim world, could actually would be welcome to come there and preach about Islam in America. And so these conversations were happening very early on. This is before the Constitution. I have another example of after the Constitution was ratified, and you have the father of the Constitution and the father of the Declaration of Independence actually having a conversation about whether we actually needed a Bill of Rights, and would that actually narrow rights, and then them sort of anguishing over the fact that even in the conversation about the Constitution, that Jews and Muslims that there was an effort to exclude them by having from holding office by religious tests. So you see them actually advocating for religious minorities inclusive of Muslims. And so there are a lot of examples. You have a former president, John Quincy Adams, actually going all the way to the Supreme Court in 1841 and defending and winning a case to free Muslims who had been described as speaking Arabic and knowing all of the Mohammedan prayers. That was one of the language that they used. Actually, invoking the Declaration of Independence in their defense and winning this case for them. So you have this presence early on in the colonial period. You have it in the early founding all the way up to now. So it's not a new conversation. It's not a new presence of Islam or Muslims.
Right.
And there's many examples of that.
And it's fascinating because you're putting the emphasis on the importance of narratives,
right,
and telling stories, and that perhaps is one of the ways in which some of the caricatures can also be countered. And I'm just wondering, Maria, if you perhaps could tell us a little bit about your experience at working with narratives and building narratives, in particular referring to I Speak for Myself, which is a book, of course, a collection of testimonies from Muslim women, but has now spawned into many different initiatives as well, including testimonies of Muslim men as well, which followed on from this. So what is the importance of telling stories, and how can these stories impact public opinion and help the conversation within the U.S. between Muslims and non-Muslims?
No, it's funny. When I first started at CNN back in 1998, almost 14 years ago, I was very young. 9/11 happened 3 years after I started. I was still very sort of naive, very, sort of immature in terms of my career, and I didn't have a lot of pull at CNN. And I remember when it happened, what I was seeing on the screen and how I thought that fundamentally contradicted everything I ever knew about my faith and everything I ever believed. And there was a split moment where I felt powerless, and then I realized I was in the most powerful profession I think exists, and that is journalism. That is the ability to sort of bring light to other people's stories. And it's fascinating because almost 10 years later, here I am launching and co-founding a publishing enterprise and a platform for people who speak for themselves. So it's completely antithetical to everything I've ever believed in as a journalist, which is that I have the power and the ability to share your stories. But what I'm finding now is the most important thing that we can do as a community, and this is really why I chose to launch I Speak for Myself, is to allow ourselves to share ourselves with each other. And that's really why I Speak for Myself was formed. I mean, when Zara Suratwala and I started writing and conceiving of the first book, Volume 1, we just wanted to write a book about Muslim women, and we initially wanted to write it ourselves, and then I realized, you know what, there's not really any merit to doing that. There are thousands of Muslim women in America that were born and raised here, just like Zara and I, who have the ability to articulate their stories and quite frankly, are rising to the occasion to do so, so why not give them that platform? And so that's how I Speak for Myself started, and what we realized is that in writing one book, we were actually giving birth to something that really is a platform now. I mean, the second book just published a few weeks ago. It's co-edited by a very well-known Muslim-American playwright by the name of Wajahat Ali. That second book of American Muslim Men is 45 stories of 45 American Muslim men. Everybody from lawyers to people who work here in Washington, D.C. Shahid Amanullah, who's at the State Department, is in the book. Preacher Moss is in the book, a very well-known American spoken word artist. Baraka Blue, a very well-known singer. And a gay imam, a transgender activist. Men who you wouldn't sort of really believe would be able to tell their stories in the way that they have, and then they're not doing it in reaction to 9/11 or in reaction to the bearded Muslim caricature. They're doing it actually for themselves, and they're doing it for our community, but in that way they're also sharing of themselves with the larger world. And so, this idea of narrative building and narrative sharing, I think, is so important. We would not have the panel that we had preceding ours if we actually had started doing this, I believe in my heart of hearts, a long time ago. And, my dad is a refugee from Uganda out of Idi Amin in the 1970s. He came here to Maryland, started working immediately, was sponsored by a Lutheran family who ended up being my third set of grandparents, got married in a Lutheran church, had an imam pray their nikah as well. And so he's an example of assimilation, but also an example of, I think, our parents' generations who worked so hard to just make it here that they weren't thinking about sharing, right? They were thinking about not really protecting themselves, but just getting through. And now you're seeing a generation like mine and Muhammad's and Precious, where we are feeling very confident in our identities, confident in our faith, confident in our professional career, and now we're actually creating these spaces for ourselves to build these narratives, to share them, and technology, and we'll talk about this later, technology has just made that so much more easier.
That's fascinating, and what I think what you're pointing to as well is the importance of actually owning the story. Stories are empowering, and turning to you, Mohamed, you wrote a blog recently on the British Council blog where you're talking about the way in which the caricatures are being created around American Muslims. So, the first caricature, the very popularized one that we all know about is very negative. The caricature of Muslims being extremists, harboring extreme ideas, etc. But you're saying in the blog that there's actually a counter caricature that is developing of the American Muslim being artist, postmodern. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about this counter caricature and whether you and how you feel that we can reach some kind of reasonable middle. I mean, do we always have to have caricatures?
I mean, I'm just so struck by what Sister Rasheeda said. I mean, if you really think about it, Muslims have been here before the United States was on this continent. But when you look at, even in our data, the Muslim American community is the only mainstream or major religious community in this country that doesn't have a racial majority. So when you talk about caricatures, I mean, it really is fascinating to think about how a caricature can be created of a group that comes from those kinds of experiences and has that kind of a demographic. On the blog entry, and I got in a lot of trouble with a lot of my friends for that. Because a lot of my friends are these amazing, amazing folks that really have broken every stereotype in any way you can imagine. But the idea really is, when was the last time you stopped a Catholic on the street and asked them about the latest ruling from the Pope? When was the last time you stopped a Protestant on the street and said, hey, I heard this wacky guy say something on TBN. What do you think about it? What's your community's position on it? It doesn't happen. And in many ways, that's what this country's about. One of my mentors once told me, in a lot of countries, people ask you, where do you come from, or what family are you from? In this country, people ask you, what do you do? Yeah. That's what defines you as an American. What do you do? Whether it's your work, whether it's how you spend your time. So certainly, I mean, these caricatures are very, and were very damaging. And I mean, I think speaking sort of beyond the generation of folks that are represented here, that the generation that's younger than us, has been called by some of the 9/11 babies. I mean, I was 18 when 9/11 happened. I was damn well not going to have somebody tell me I was a terrorist. But if I was 12, it's a totally different dynamic. And what these young people and the generations younger than them are dealing with, it so goes far beyond a discussion about a positive caricature or a bad caricature. In terms of the bad caricature, there's truth to it. There are people who have conducted acts of criminal behavior that are labeled terrorists or terrorism, whether it's here or in the world. On the other side, on the positive side, there are amazing, wonderful people that went to law school and decided to write plays for a living and immensely succeeded at it, that are poets, that are actors. So all of that is part of the story. But I think the goal, or sort of the touchdown for Muslims in this country, will be when you turn on the television and see a Muslim winning Chopped on the cooking channel, when you turn on television and see a Muslim talking about where to invest your money, or how to refinance the loan on your house, when you see Muslims playing public roles that have really nothing to do with them being a Muslim, or where they go to pray at the end of the week, or whether or not they choose to pray, or what their sexual orientation is, I think that really is now sort of the next goal for this community. We've gotten beyond, we're not all terrorists. We're still working on getting beyond. We are not all immigrants from some other part of the world whose parents moved here 30 years ago, and I'm included in that group. My parents came here from Egypt. But that there is an enormous, very rich part of our community in this country that built this country. And that's the African American community, and has for too long been sort of sidestepped, ignored, or just forgotten. So when we get beyond, we're not just all terrorists, but we also don't all have to be these eclectic sort of thespian, amazing, wonderful people that many of us are. And those people should absolutely get their due and get their place in the spotlight. But when our community, and really this is a community issue, can begin to see ourselves as what Dr. Sherman Jackson talks about as going from assimilation to belongingness. Going from I'm not a threat to you to I'm just another kid on the block, and I'm trying to make the varsity basketball team. I'm trying to get into a good college, and I'm going to work with whoever in my community can help me build a network that don't necessarily have a Muslim name or an Arabic last name as a mentor, and get to that next level for myself, my family, and my community.
Right. That's fascinating, and I'm just wondering whether, as part of the effort, the kind of initiatives that tend to bring together Muslims with other religious faiths can play a role in improving understanding between different communities. And Imam Magid, I mean, you've been doing quite a lot of work at the interfaith level. How successful are these initiatives? In other words, I mean, some of these initiatives tend to be really about learning from each other, learning about each other's traditions, each other's religion, and then finding out that, well, in the end, we pray the same God or we have the same values. Are these effective, or is it more effective to actually bring together people from different faiths and give them a common goal, working together for their communities, for the environment, etc.?
Yeah, thank you. The issue of interfaith have moved from holding hand and singing "We Are the World" to a real, understanding one another. We move from the issue of tolerance to understanding, from working to working together now. I will give you a few examples, and I do believe this American Muslims should know about those, and American public should know about those, events. After 9/11, our mosque was vandalized, and it was in Washington Post. And then next day, Jewish American, Christian American, Sikh American came to the mosque with flowers, with donation, and the Jewish American bring one of the biggest posters I have seen, signed by the children, saying that we welcome you, we love you, we want you to be here. And the next year, the Christians and the Jewish, they spend the night in the parking lot of Adams until next day in the morning. And we prayed our morning prayer in the parking lot. How many of you heard of this story? It is the story of the Muslim American sharing a synagogue to be a place where we play Friday in two synagogues. Actually, we share, there's a full mosque, a branch of Adams in a synagogue in Reston, in Ashburn. And then a part-time place being used for the Friday prayer and the night prayer in Ramadan in a synagogue. That's a relation of trust now. It's not just, prove that you're okay. Now, the amazing experience I had of the foundation, the founding of the Shoulder to Shoulder. At the time that there was the Rhetoric of burning Holy Quran by Jones in Florida, and Park 51 issue in New York, about 26 religious organizations, they get together and they said, we will not allow that to happen to the Muslims. Attacking one religion, it's attacking all religions in America. And they held a press conference where they spoke very forcefully about the rights of Muslims to be in this country. And then they established an organization called Shoulder to Shoulder. They paid dues, actually. Reverend Gary is sitting there. And now they have a full-time, Christina is here, a full-time executive director dealing with the rights of Muslims in this country. I think that's really what the hope is. I see always the light in the end of the tunnel. I can tell you that when the Americans, Jewish and Christians, come to the mosque at the time of difficulties, and Muslims feel now it is not only them, but the community now. Their community is their pastors and the rabbi. As a matter of fact, then I have a member of my community here. They joke about the synagogue that where we pray, and they call the rabbi Noshansak rabbi/imam, because he been many times at Adams Center speaking to the community. I do believe that by having people of faith to work together in the United States and have our children having projects and really get to know one another, most of this stereotype and misunderstanding, misconception will tend to become a friendship and a working relationship. And that's my hope, and I'm very optimistic. Of all the things I said earlier, I think I'm very optimistic of what I've seen coming out from the faith community.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Imam Magid. I'd really like at this stage to open it up to the floor, because I really want this to be as much of a dialogue as possible and give a chance to you really to engage with our panel. So I'll invite questions, I think, at this stage. We have 2 microphones that are roaming. I think the gentleman on the left is inviting the lady on the right, very politely, or the reverse, to take up the mic. Please, if you don't mind just introducing yourself, saying who you are, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
My name is Manjula Kumar. I'm Project Director at the Education Office at the Smithsonian Institution. I'd really like to thank the Newseum for hosting a very important theme for all of us, not only in this city but beyond, and thank the British Council for participating. The earlier panel, dealt with laws, etc., which is very important for us to be aware of and to have the knowledge of. And for this panel, I would like to just bring attention to that at the Smithsonian, you hear about objects and we do programs, education programs. In September, I'm working on a 2-day symposium, Sufism at the Smithsonian, Searching for the Divine Through the Arts. And as a public institution, I think it's a public trust. It is very important for the Smithsonian and other institutions like this to bring awareness, to bring the knowledge, to bring the education to not only, it's not only just a celebration of the arts and culture, the faith of Muslims, but for the sharing that Maria touched on, and Imam Mohamed Magid talked about the interfaith. So I am saying, on a positive note, that this is the path to take, from both sides, and the more that we do in a public arena and public institutions, bring groups, bring people who are leading lights, who are showing the way, but in my case, or in our case, we are saying through the arts. And I would just like to get a feedback from the panel as to, is this the way, or what are the... And, especially what Maria said about CNN. I mean, a lot of us, I think, who watch what's being shown over there don't agree, don't think that's, the reality. And the more we do programs and projects and discussions like this is the way I think we will move from caricature to reality.
Thank you. Maria, did you want to react to this?
Thank you, Ms. Kumar, for your comments. Yes, I mean, so obviously I don't agree with everything that we put on our air, but as the head of the interview department at CNN Worldwide, I can tell you that it is a work in progress. We can't, really get past the gender parity piece of our equation right now at CNN. As you all might have seen, I mean, there's lots of studies that have been done about the mainstream media in particular, and the amount of women's voices versus men's voices that appear, for example, in opinion pages. Only 13% of women are represented on opinion sections across our country in print. That is an astounding statistic. And, organizations like the Op-Ed Project and other organizations across this country that are working with academics, female academics, rising politicians, to really hone what that narrative is and how to tell that story, I think is only going to help that number increase. But it's disappointing. I'm not going to get into the statistics at CNN, but I will tell you we're not there in terms of representing accurately the number of women in our audience, or frankly, the number of women represented by the American population, which is a little over 50%. We're not there yet in terms of those women's voices being represented as accurately on our air. So that is something that I am very passionate about as a women's college graduate, someone who's passionate about women's issues. I work on every day. To your point about arts, right, I really, really firmly believe that the way to get past this caricature is through arts and culture. In I Speak for Myself, Volume 1, there are many examples of women who are artists, who are spoken word artists, who are journalists, who are essayists, who are writers, who have chosen professions that are sort of the antithetical, right, of what our cultural sort of norms would tell us to do. And in the men's book in particular, there are even more examples of that. Wajahat Ali, who I mentioned earlier, is an example. I think you were referring to him when we talk about someone who is a trained lawyer who's decided that he wants to, through his word, through his written word, change the narrative. And he even told me that the way that I would introduce him, that we should introduce him in terms of the co-editor of the book, is superhero of changing the Muslim American narrative by day and lawyer by night. He moonlights as a lawyer. This is what he has chosen to sort of really do and be, to his community, but also at large. And I will tell you that what really resonates is the arts and culture movement, and what is resonating right now. In fact, Wajahat on his own is hosting an event here at Busboys and Poets on July 16th, where he's gathered men and women from around this community here in D.C. to sort of showcase their art, right, as a way to help, create some momentum around this idea that changing narratives can happen through arts and culture. And we were actually approached, the Women of I Speak for Myself, and I've been working very hard on a project with the International Museum of Women, which is launching, hopefully, next year, an entire online exhibition of Muslim women's arts and voices, connecting the 40 women from our book with 40 women from 40 different countries overseas, all of whom are Muslim. So through that project, museums from around the world will then contribute to sharing this narrative through art and culture. And I will tell you that kind of storytelling, if people actually put it out there, the art and culture community will build then art and culture around that. So it's very important.
Great. The gentleman on my left.
Thank you. Todd Gallinger from CARE again. Mohamed, I think you brought up a fascinating point with Muslims being the only religious minority that doesn't have a racial majority, but we certainly do have a very, very strong and almost majority plurality in African American Muslims. However, the caricatures that are out there are, like we've discussed, all immigrant based. Why is this very, very significant chunk, almost a majority of the American Muslim community, not a part of that narrative or that image that we see? Yeah. Is that some inherent bias in the media, or is that due to dynamics, and what are those dynamics within the American Muslim community?
Yeah, I think it's both, and that's an excellent question. Part of it definitely is, and first of all, in defense of, not that she needs any, in defense of Maria, we have to keep in mind, like, media is a business. And the reason that we watch TV is not actually because of the shows we're watching, it's because of the commercials that are being run in between the segments that we're watching. So it's important for us to have a realist view of why certain stories make the headlines and why others don't. I think that ties into what we saw happen after 9/11, particularly with sort of the cable news world, particularly I think with sort of Fox and MSNBC on the sides, and the stories that made sense to them at the time that would attract viewers, that would catch people's attentions, and that was, do you look like or sound like the 19 guys who took over these planes and just destroyed major landmarks across our country? The other part of that, I think, and honestly, I place most of the blame on that really on the intra-community issues. One of the major challenges, and something that Imam Magid has really been a champion on, is building these relationships between the different communities within the Muslim American umbrella in this country, because they are different communities. Part of it is, if I'm a South Asian or Middle Eastern immigrant to this country, I'm a doctor or an engineer or a lawyer. The number one reason why I came to this country is probably to give my kids a good economic opportunity, and the socioeconomics of America at large happen to make it so that there probably aren't a lot of African Americans living in my community if I live in La Cañada, if we're from LA. Part of the American story has dictated that. But a bigger part of it really is honestly the failure of Muslim American communities and organizations to really reach out to the other segments of the American population that happen to be Muslim. And I think we've seen, that's another area, Emmanuel, I think where we've seen progress, but certainly we're not even half the way there. In terms of where we need to be. I could very clearly tell you, just from my personal experience, if this was, August of 2002, this panel would look very different. And there probably would not be 2 women, and one of those women would not probably be an African American. And that's not to tokenize anybody up on this stage. It's just to be honest and frank about where we were, where we've come, and I think where we need to move in the future.
Probably wouldn't be anybody under 30 either. So
that's actually a great point.
I'd actually like to.
Yes, please go ahead, Precious.
As the African American.
And then Imam Magid.
Just to speak to a point that you made a little bit earlier, Mohamed, when you said about Professor Jackson talking about moving from assimilation to belonging. And I think that's interesting in terms of the conversations between the communities, because I come from a historical community under the leadership of Imam Rasheeda Muhammad, who passed away in 2008. And that community has always had that sense of belonging, has always had that engagement. And actually brought something that I wanted to show.
Yes,
it's very quick. It's like 20 seconds. Just to give an example of that community, one of the things that we often talk about in our collective DNA as a community is that, there's no, the highest purpose for human life and existence is community life. And that's something that's a part of our language that you'll often hear. You'll probably be able to identify people from that community because they're always talking about community engagement outside of just our own group. And so you have then out of that community coming the first congressman, the first Muslim congressman in the history of the United States, the first Muslim mayor, the first Muslim chaplain in the military, one of the earliest identifiable Muslim judges, Adam Shakur from Michigan. And so you have that, and to not know that history, to not look at that as a collective history, and to be able to embrace that, it's really problematic. I wanted to show this clip of Imam Mohamed in 1993 and in 1997, but this is just 1993, the first time that a Muslim was invited to be a part of inaugural inaugural activities for a U.S. president, and it's just like a couple of seconds, if we could.
Our prophet said, he saw in a vision the followers of Moses, the followers of Christ Jesus, and his followers, peace be upon the prophets, in heaven, in paradise.
So I just wanted to show that. It's much longer, but we have this history where we're very involved, and there was actually a photo of Imam Mohamed in the 70s carrying the U.S. flag across the stage in a mosque in Chicago, which actually I ended up going to school there at that same, the mosque was next door to the school on Stony Island, and now that property is actually owned by the Nation of Islam, but at one time it was owned by our community. And him carrying this flag across the stage and saying, if you won't pick up this flag, I will. Because this experience, if we could show it, it's actually a historical photo from Wali Akbar Muhammad. But, this idea that we're a part of America, we always belong to this place. It's our shared history, and, that we're going to love it and make it better. So this is actually the photo of him in the 70s carrying that flag across the stage. And probably getting a lot of flack for it during that time, but sort of like ahead of his time. And then the last example I'll give is Congressman Ellison. When Imam Mohamed passed away, he did an interview with NPR, and he said that during his campaign, when he got a lot of the negative feedback from the various communities, that Imam Mohamed had came to his house and told him, don't worry about the noise that's out there, just elevate humanity. So just get out there and do the engagement. And so then you see he focused on that, and he still focuses on that today. So I just wanted to give those examples.
Great. Can I actually just make a very... Sure. When I moved to Washington 6 or 7 years ago, and Imam Magid is going to box my ears after we get off the stage for saying this, I asked people, is there a mosque in D.C.? Everybody mentioned the Adams Center. Adams Center is an amazing, amazing place. But I don't have a car. And most people don't realize that there actually is a masjid here in D.C. It's off of Q Street. That gentleman that we just saw it was one of the leaders and founders of that masjid, and I think even just that sort of awareness really represents the degree to which there are not divisions but gaps of connection within our community that we really need to work on and build off together.
Great.
I would like just to say one more thing about this. There's two issues about this. One is the Americanism of an African American is not questionable, and therefore they separate the African American from being Muslims to be only African American. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, he's Muslim. Muhammad Ali is Muslim. In all of this rhetoric after 9/11, have you heard about Muhammad Ali being a Muslim? Because people were able to separate. And that's a failure for the community also. You need to claim, a mistake, maybe what failure is too strong, that Muslim Americans have to claim those individuals as their own. And you have Sharif from Atlanta. You have Shaquille O'Neal. You have many musicians, rap music, that they're Muslims. But they've been identified only as African American, not as African American Muslims. Islam been associated in America with immigrants. Unfortunately, we need to change that narrative. To say that Islam have been here for a long time, and many African Americans who was leaders, congressmen, and mayor, and judges, and so forth, all those are Muslims. This is one thing. Secondly, I would like to say that as America is, Dr. Jackson, since you quoted him, is negotiating his identity, Muslims are doing the same. We as American Muslims, we're evolving. And there's an evolution of this community. And I can tell you that my work now with my brothers and sisters African American is really become like a sister organization. Like this masjid here, talking about Masjid Muhammad and Adams are a sister organization. Therefore, there's evolution taking place, and I think part of this identity searching taking place in America.
Great. I'd like to ask the lady on my right.
Hello, my name is Maheen Ahmad, and I'm a student at the University of Florida. I just wanted to ask a question. Like, I grew up in a Muslim community in Miami, which is my hometown, and I definitely saw a huge disconnect after 9/11, where the Muslim people I knew, especially the ones my age, they were like just typical students being integrated in the mainstream community, just trying to pursue their career goals, and then the portrayal of Muslims in the public media, and usually they were just like narrowly defined as Arabic, victimized women, in veils. I wonder, how did that happen? Like, who influenced that portrayal? Is it the public? How does that translate into the media portrayal of Muslims in America? And is there any motive behind that?
I think that portrayal existed before 9/11. I was not that old when the Ayatollah Khomeini and sort of the Iranian Revolution happened, but I think it started there. But I think it was a curiosity that turned negative, I believe. Historically, and I think it started around the Iranian Revolution and just kept going. This sort of mystery behind sort of the covered woman, right, and all of the subjugation implications and all of the stereotyping that led to that. And then I think when 9/11 happened, it wasn't the female Muslim that was under fire, under the microscope, it was the male. But that perception, this is just me being sociological, not even journalistic, but just thinking that the perception that the people behind that subjugation are men, and then seeing Muhammad Atta and all those photos up there just kind of made that stereotype just kind of tumble over itself over and over again. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying that there's been I think there was an existing sort of, I'm not even sure what the right word is, superstition or level of mistrust about the faith even before 9/11 really happened. And I think the only way to correct that is this idea that you have to, again, share the narrative and, to Mohammed's point, speak about yourself and reveal yourself as more than just a Muslim. And I think to Imam Magid's point, when you talk about Muhammad Ali and you talk about Shaquille O'Neal, Americans knew them as people who were excelling in their career, who won awards, who happened to be Muslim. And, you know, I'm not here to judge who puts their Muslim faith before everything and who doesn't. I mean, that's everyone's individual decision. All I'm saying is the media portrayal then happens because people see they see your successes first because that's what you choose to put out there, or they see your religion first. And I think now we're starting to see a reverse of that. And, you know, somebody else earlier was talking about, I think it was you, Mohamed, talking about how, you know, the day this reversal will really happen and the day that this sort of integration of the American Muslim identity with the sort of the general American identity will happen is when you see Dr. Muhammad so-and-so on the air talking about, you know, a heart attack, you know, that somebody had, or, you know, frankly, when you see our own Ali Velshi on the air, who doesn't outwardly profess his Muslim identity or his background, but who happens to be a really good business journalist who knows the markets very well and knows how to tell the American people what it means for them. And he just happens to be from a background that is of Muslim persuasion.
Fareed Zakaria.
Oh, I just wanted to say to the point really quickly.
Sure.
I think Muhammad Ali actually might be the exception to that. And maybe not now, but back then when he's like, you know, call me Muhammad Ali, you know,
Right.
call me Cassius Clay. So, you know, he very much put his religion
Right.
out there and his name. And I think maybe less people know that less today, but during that time period it was very difficult for him because he did that. So, yeah.
Mohamed, just to build on that question, and what Mario was just saying, have we actually overstated the importance of 9/11 in terms of, you know, affecting the perception of Muslims in America? I mean, has it been really this watershed? What do the numbers and the figures tell us about that?
Well, you know, it's easy to say that today, and God forbid if there's another major terrorist attack, you know, domestically in this country tomorrow, you know, what I'm going to say is going to sound really out of whack. And I think that's part of what we need to keep in mind. I think the relative quiet that we've had since 9/11 on the terrorism front in this country, certainly obviously nothing close to what we saw on those days, has been a part of that narrative seeming less real. But I think that clearly, you know, the dynamic that was created behind that narrative and the alienation component of it is still very much intact. I think, you know, CAP's report, Fear Inc., and I know that we have a panel later today on the whole Sharia controversy, is a very clear example of how, you know, those networks are still kicking and alive and just ready, you know, to take off. They're just waiting for the news hook, you know? They're just waiting to be relevant again. So certainly, you know, from a data perspective, the security issues matter. I mean, one thing that we found, and this is something that we measure all over the world. Gallup, you know, doesn't just do polling in the United States. We have this thing called the World Poll. We've been in the Arab Spring countries, what I hate that term, what people are calling the Arab Spring countries. What we saw as the most indicative sort of stability measure or social cohesion measure that we, in all of the questions that we've been asking in those countries, actually is well-being. And it's actually two questions, rating your life on a scale from 1 to 10. 1 is the worst, 10 is the best, today and tomorrow. Today and in the future, in the next 5 years. And based on your responses, you're sort of placed into these three categories: thriving, struggling, suffering. We asked those questions in the U.S. as well, and what we found are that the statistical drivers that are most relevant to Muslim Americans having higher well-being scores, the number one factor was having confidence in the FBI. So even though the narrative, the focus, everything that we've been talking about is important, you know, I don't want anybody to walk away feeling that, oh, you know, this just doesn't really matter, everything's fine, you know, the terrorism thing's over. No. And American Muslims actually have higher levels of confidence in most other national institutions, including, for example, the electoral process, when compared to the general public. But they have lower levels of confidence in almost every institution that we asked about that's played a major role in the war on terrorism: the FBI, the military, and related institutions. So it's important for us to certainly pat ourselves on the back a little bit that the discourse has moved beyond that. But the data clearly indicates that it's still a major issue. And it's still a major sort of pressure point for that sense of belongingness for Muslims in this country.
Okay, let's take another question from the floor. The lady on my left.
Thank you. In the name of the one who loves us all. This really is a question, I guess, for Mariam and for Imam Magid. First, Mariam, we're talking about building community. And I work with many interfaith groups. One of them is the 9/11 Unity Walk Steering Committee. And there's a 9/11 Unity Walk that was an answer to 9/11 that started, around 2001 when that happened. And it is an interfaith reaction where many different faith traditions come together. And they meet at the Washington Hebrew congregation, the largest congregation in Washington. And they have the Muslim call to prayer in a synagogue. And all the churches and temples along Massachusetts Avenue open their doors so people can come in and be able to see the different religions. It's very open. There's not that much press that's given to that. There's more press given to the damage that 9/11 did and the division that was caused by 9/11, and not as much focus on the rebuilding of our community. And so there's so many different organizations that I work with. As Imam Magid mentioned, the Jewish Islamic Dialogue Society that brought 90 Jews and Muslims together to do a social action day to get to know one another. There's so many wonderful things that are happening with twinning from the Foundation of Ethnic Understanding, with over 100 mosques and synagogues twinning together. And of course, the initial beginnings of that are very awkward. When a synagogue has never hosted a Muslim community, and I actually witnessed that the other night. Documentaries can be done. That can be drama. That can be sensational in and of itself. So the first question to you, Mariam, is can the media be a partner to the transformation of our society rather than a reflection of our consciousness now? Can it be a reflection of what we hope to be one day?
Maria?
Of course. I mean, the media can certainly reflect what it is that's happening on the ground. I believe, here's an example of advocacy journalism that CNN is doing, right? But it has nothing to do with faith. I mean, every faith community, every human believes that slavery is wrong, I would imagine, right? So the one thing that we have enterprised and taken a hold of at CNN, and I'm proud to be a part of it, is the CNN Freedom Project. That has gotten recognition from the U.S. State Department. In fact, many of the stories that we've told have actually forced governments to go in and do something about what's happening. But to your point, CNN's belief blog didn't even exist after 9/11. Religion reporting at CNN really was sort of non-existent around 9/11. And what we have found, and this has been a learning experience for CNN and the people who run the organization, is that faith and identity play a very important role in American society. And people want to read stories through the lens of faith. And to your point, I agree with you. All of the stories that you've discussed have merits. In fact, I believe we did cover, it might have been a small piece of coverage, but we did cover the twinning initiative when it first was launched. And, I think to ask whether or not, why a story gets merit over another story, it's all about timing. I have probably 1,000 emails in my inbox of people today telling me why is CNN covering only the healthcare story today when there are a number of other SCOTUS decisions that were made that have equal impact and viability in terms of certain people because they are focused on their initiative or their agenda. So, what I would say is that there has been a learning process. I can speak for CNN in that we really have recognized that religion reporting and doing storytelling and reporting through the lens of faith is very important. So I would encourage you, if you feel like you have a story to share, to feel like there is an ally with my organization in the Belief blog. Again, it's the #1 religion sort of blog out there, most widely read, and it's only been in existence for 2.5 years. So we really know and have been told through our audiences that it matters. So to that extent, I would just encourage you to reach out again.
Thank you. And
Great,
then my second question, briefly, really to piggyback on the media, is education. You know, prejudice is the child of ignorance. Ignorance then can be corrected with education. So the question for Imam Magid is, are there any initiatives that the Adams Center, or you being president of the Islamic Society of North America, doing to sit down with the media, to really have a talk with them, to educate them about Sharia, to educate them about the wonderful projects that are going on, so it's not just as a reaction to something that's been sensational in the news?
Thank you. Imam Magid.
I would like to say that media have been very nice to Adams Center, that they cover so many stories. The story of the synagogue, praying in the synagogue, been covered by 101 news agencies. From Saudi TV, I was in Saudi TV with the rabbi, imagine, for 45 minutes, and from the Indonesian media everywhere. I think some of the stories are really being heard, people have heard, but I do believe there's a lot of rhetoric that's louder than those events that we're doing, whether it's the issue about Sharia or the issue about Muslim women. I think we have to create our own narrative, stories, and with social media, by the way, you create an alternative as well. You get to this blog, and I believe, and you write your story, Huffington Post, you can write there's other ways we can get the word out, I think. But Wajahad Ali and others give me a lot of hope, and I'm very happy to hear this, initiative of the book, of the stories. For so long, I've been saying to myself, I wish second generation Muslim would take this project and write stories of American Muslims, average American Muslims. That's why we can give each journalist this book. That would be, if somebody would like to donate money for that. I will take that project. Send it just to everybody. Let them read
Imam
it.
Magid's now the publicist for the I Speak for Myself series.
We have 3 more questions, and I'd like to take them in sequence in order, or 4, it seems. I'd like to take them in sequence, one after the other, and to give a chance for all the questions to be heard, and to give a chance also to our panelists to answer them. So I'll start with the lady on my right.
Be quick, I promise. Just thank you quickly for especially shedding light to the diversity of Islam. I think that was needed. I have a personal question, so please indulge me in just the topic of visual difference. I want to press her on points both Muhammad and Maria said in terms of, being part of American General Society by just talking about something that's unrelated to Islam and having that name, be of that origin. But then where does the hijab come in, and how can we change the perception of it being an other factor? So if you could just, talk about that.
Okay.
Thank you. That's a very good question.
My question kind of relates to that, actually. My name's Shireen Zaman, and as we were organizing the panel, we actually thought about organizing a specific panel on Muslim women. And then I had an experience where I was asked to speak on a panel on Muslim women's leadership, and that was the only panel in the entire conference where there were any women. So to your point, Mohammed, that we've progressed in terms of integrating our panels in age and gender. But I would like to ask, and I think fortunately the men on this panel are some of the biggest champions of Muslim women that we have in our community. So I'd like to ask you to comment on sort of the gender divide, sort of the challenges and stereotypes of Muslim women, kind of following up on the earlier question.
Thank you, Shireen. The lady on my left, please.
My question refers to what your opinion is on the value and how and the extent of the value of shows like The American Muslim, how far did it go in changing the conversation and the narrative? And the second part of the question is, how do we address those very critical voices that came up from our own Muslim community that were very critical of the show, that it did not show Islam in a good light, it did not show Muslims in a good light, and we don't support that show?
Thank you. Please.
Wow, I hate to follow
right?
that. I hate to follow that question. I'm sorry. My name is Cal Skaggs, and I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I've made many, many films. And I made quite a few films about religion and public life. The first film's about the religious right in our country, etc. I'm at work on a film about minority religions, it's a feature-length film, which will portray, one wants to say profile, but not in this context, which will portray a mosque in Patterson, New Jersey, a Sunni mosque, the Islamic center of Passaic County, and a church in El Mataria, Cairo. It'll be about 2/3 about Islam and 1/3 about Coptic Christians. Now, I settled on this mosque after visiting mosques all along the East Coast, and after talking to people largely in CARE and other organizations from Houston to Orange County to Minneapolis. But here is my question, finally. You said, Maria, it is time that Muslims present themselves as not just practicing their faiths earlier on. And then I must be one of the early buyers of your book, the All-American 45 Muslim. And I'm only through the first 20 because I try to absorb each one. But there aren't many whose faith seem very important to them. So here is my question. In getting rid of the caricature, well, maybe I'm wrong, in getting rid of the caricature, is there a danger that in order to show, oh, we're all just like everybody else, and we have DJs, and we have jazz musicians, and we have, this and we have that, and not having many really deeply spiritual imams? I've found an incredible number of people in their 20s and their 60s at the Passaic Mosque who are deeply spiritual people, and yet, are lawyers and have lots of career opportunities, etc. But I'm sorry. But the point is there a danger of throwing out what is, I want to say, almost blessed about Islam, as each faith has as its center, by emphasizing, well, we're just the world. We're just like the rest of you. We're not very distinctive.
Thank you so much, sir. So I will ask each of you perhaps to pick and choose some of these questions, and hopefully among the four of you we'll have covered the ground. We had a question on the wearing of the hijab. We had a question on gender, the gender divide within the Muslim community, one on addressing critical voices in the community, and our last gentleman's question regarding the risk by getting rid of the caricature to actually have, lose some degree of specific identity, particularly on the religious side. I'll start with you, Imam Magid, and then we'll work our way.
Very quickly, although I like to have Muslim American being represented in different lights, I do agree that there's a danger of saying that in order to be fitting in, that I do drink, I do this, do that. I'm not like the other Muslims who are really practicing in a particular way, or I think that, or sometimes to overemphasize hijab versus non-hijab, to say that, okay, let us tell you that, no, not all Muslim women wear hijab. What are you saying in the statement? We have to be careful of how we frame the argument. Because if you're saying that, you're feeding the stereotype sometime to say, yeah, you might think that way about women wearing hijab, but we are not wearing hijab. That is, I've seen that, by the way, being debated. Very funny that the very conservative Americans who don't like Islam, I'm just going to be honest, they want to Islam to be liberal. Honestly, they will say, okay, we like this Muslim, but we don't like this Muslim. I would like to say Muslim America, like any other religious community, we have conservative, we have liberal, we have others. You cannot pick and choose to say, this is what we like, that's what we're going to throw the rest. That is the argument that he said, and I can hear that from the community. The second issue about the women, I would like to say that, first of all, there's 6 women in my house. My wife and 5 daughters. I did not marry 6 women. Okay? So that, don't cut the tape, okay? Now, it is very important that we see the evolution of Muslim Americans in terms of the role of women. Adam Center, half of the people in charge of the different committees, or more than that, are women. And I became president of ISNA after Ingrid Mattson, the president of the Islamic Society of North America. But there's a lot to be worked on in this area, but there's certain issues that concern the larger community as well, Muslim community. The issue of domestic violence, for example. It's not a Muslim problem. It is the problem for the whole society. And there's certain issue still that we have to work on in something regarding the mosque being women-friendly in some areas. But I do think we have made some progress in this regard.
Maria.
I'm going to address the All-American reality show series, and I will emphasize reality. I was very disturbed, frankly, by the response from the American Muslim community about how Islam was portrayed. I mean, I liken this is entertainment television, folks. This is all about creating storylines. You would probably have the women who are pageant moms complaining about toddlers and tiaras not representing pageant children and pageant parenting in the same way that I think, and I'm not trying to, this might be apples and oranges to some people, but I'm just trying to make a comparison. It's reality television, it's entertainment. It is not a news documentary that has to go at it from both perspectives. That said, I will also say that they chose that community for very specific reasons. Dearborn, Michigan clearly has a concentrated Muslim population of a very specific ethnicity, by the way, and so they probably felt that, I'm not defending them, but I'm assuming they felt that the storylines sort of met what they thought would make compelling television. I think what it did do is actually create a conversation about the backlash that can be created as a result of this, with the Lowe's controversy and so on. But also it didn't really portray the American Muslim community in a good light, in the sense that it felt to me like the community was speaking up against it rather than supporting what I think was actually a good intention, which was to tell the stories of American Muslims, albeit in a very concentrated part of our country. To your point about I speak for myself, I encourage you to finish the book. I also would encourage you, as I would encourage anyone from the American Muslim community who reads books like this, to the whole point of I speak for myself, and I think the idea that these women, and in fact one of them is sitting in this room, Dr. Zahra Jamal, was a part of this book. We actually all coalesced around this book because of our faith. Not because we wanted to just tell stories about us being Muslim and American, but because of our faith. We felt so strongly about our faith that we wanted to share our personal stories with other people, including those from our own community. And, everyone's going to have a different judgment as to how faithful someone is. Frankly, I don't think you can judge someone's faith by a 1,500-word essay. All we're trying to do in these collections is really to just give people a glimpse of what a person's life is really like. And I think, faith is it's very personal, but the fact that people were able to open up about it in this way, I think, again, goes a long way from where we were 5 or 6 years ago.
Thank you, Maria.
Awesome. I'm going to get myself in trouble and try to comment on the reality TV show. You will never, ever catch me on record saying anything nice about reality TV shows. I just don't understand them. But I think that one thing that really came out in that show is that, for me, it was a very typical reality TV show. What's interesting, though, was what happened after or during it was being aired. That whole movement of this needs to be taken off, in the same way that some Muslims are saying, oh, this doesn't represent Islam because of X, Y, and Z. There were other people saying this doesn't represent Islam because you don't have a terrorist on the show. I mean, literally, people were making this argument. But what ended up happening? Russell Simmons came through and saved the day. I mean, that's literally what happened. By coming in and buying out or offering to buy out all of the ad spots that these other companies were going to pull their money from the show. So it's a very clear example. And by the way, he happens to be, the chairperson leader of the FEU, the organization that was mentioned earlier that does the twinning between the mosques and the synagogues. I mean, that was a clear example of a very quintessential reality TV show, and also a very quintessential example of very minute, but very, small in number, but very loud voices that were arguing for exclusion, and a non-Muslim ally, not because we're Muslim, but because we're part of his community, stepped up to the plate and said, hey, you know what? This is ridiculous. I'm going to do something about it. On Shireen's point, on the women and the whole gender divide in the community, I'm a big fan of not having a bunch of guys on a panel talking about women's issues. I just don't think that's productive. At the same time, I've always felt, and this is on a very sort of personal level, this has nothing to do with what I do at Gallup, on a very personal level, I feel that the role for men in the Muslim community is really to make sure that there are opportunities for leadership for women within that community. Not to play the token role, but so that they can themselves, they know the issues better than anybody, they know how to solve the issues, and what we need to do is get out of the way. And as men in the community, when we see those barriers popping up, it's our job to be allies or to lead, if the case need be, in getting those barriers out of the way.
Thank you so much, Mohamed. Precious, some final comments, please.
Well, I agree with a lot of the things that Maria said when she was talking about All-American Muslim and also about the book. I speak for myself. I contributed to a book called Living Islam Out Loud, and with some of the same criticism, I think, or not criticism, but some of the same feedback. And I think that you do have to be very careful about how you define who's spiritual, who's not. I mean, somebody's spirituality might be defined by going out and feeding the homeless, but they may never speak about religion or Islam because that's just not what they do. They may actually feel very deeply about it, but they may just not bring it up at all. And so we sometimes have these certain ideas about how that is expressed from the example of like a very righteous man and, always sort of like, reciting surahs from the Quran or something like that, and verses from the Quran or something like that. And that's not always how it happens. So I do think that's important. All-American Muslim, I enjoyed it thoroughly. I know even from my even a lot of African Americans, I just think in terms of the African American Muslim community, sort of frustrated that, there wasn't that representation there. But I didn't feel that way. I think we all have to make our case to get our stories out there. There are lots of people in the African American Muslim community who have power in the media to do that, and I think that they really have to try to make that effort happen more effectively. In terms of it, even though it was a different ethnicity that was represented, I could see all of those stories represented in various ways from Muslims that I know. So I think it was a good first, and that it opened the doorway for more, and that's basically it. Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We've already run over time a little bit, so I will just like to thank our panelists again. We've had a fascinating discussion, learned a great deal, and I think that one of the things that I'm taking home as well, in a way, is the enlightenment as well about the internal diversity within the Muslim community in America. Lots of hope, but also lots of reasons to remain cautious. So I'd like to invite you to thank our 4 panelists, Imam Magid, Ebrahimji, Mohamed Younis, Precious Mohammed. Thank you again.
Thank you.